Between September 23rd and 25th, 1979, 14 men vanished from their camps, scattered across the Atchafalaya Basin in south-central Louisiana. By September 28th, all 14 bodies had been recovered from shallow water, each eliminated with close-range shotgun blasts or deep knife wounds to the chest and throat. The perpetrators weren't rival gangs from New Orleans, weren't federal agents conducting raids, weren't even strangers to the victims. They were three brothers from the Boudreaux family, Jean-Paul, Marcel, and Étienne, moving through the swamps like the gator hunters they'd been since childhood, methodically erasing everyone connected to a theft that had stripped them of 2 years of work. The FBI would later classify it as the most systematic elimination in Louisiana swamp history, but the motive wasn't drugs, wasn't a blood feud passed down through generations, wasn't even competition over fishing territory. It was 200 alligator hides worth $15,000, stolen from a drying shed in the dead of night, representing the only income three brothers had to feed their families. And one man's unshakable belief that in the deep bayou, where law enforcement was 40 miles away and justice moved slower than the current, you handled your own business, settled your own debts, protected your own blood. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events that occurred in the isolated waterways of Louisiana, where men lived by codes older than any law written in distant courtrooms, and where stealing another man's livelihood wasn't just theft, but a declaration of war that demanded an answer written in gunpowder and blood. The Atchafalaya Basin in 1979 was a world unto itself. 860,000 acres of swampland, cypress groves, and black water channels that stretched across 7 parishes in south-central Louisiana, the largest river swamp in North America, home to approximately 3,000 people living in camps, houseboats, and stilt houses scattered throughout a wilderness that had resisted every attempt at civilization for 2 centuries. The basin sprawled between the Atchafalaya River and countless smaller bayous, a maze of waterways so complex that outsiders got lost within hours, where channels that looked navigable dead-ended in thick stands of cypress, where the water varied from 6 inches to 20 feet deep within 100 yards, where entire communities existed that didn't appear on any map. In September of 1979, temperatures in the basin hovered around 90 degrees during the day, dropping to maybe 75 at night. But the humidity made it feel 10 degrees hotter, the air so thick with moisture you could almost drink it. The smell was distinctive, a mix of decaying vegetation, fish, diesel fuel from boat motors, and that particular scent of stagnant water that people who live in swamps learn to ignore. At dawn, fog rolled across the water like a living thing, so dense you couldn't see your own boat's bow. The sounds were constant, bullfrogs bellowing from every direction, insects creating a wall of noise, the splash of alligators sliding off logs, the distant put-put-put of small boat motors, and occasionally the deeper rumble of a shrimp boat heading toward the Gulf. By 1979, the basin was dying economically. Commercial fishing, which had sustained families for generations, was collapsing. Overfishing in the Gulf of Mexico meant fewer shrimp, fewer crabs, fewer fish making their way into the basin's nursery waters. The oil boom that had brought money in the 60s and early 70s was ending as companies pulled out, leaving behind abandoned drilling platforms and polluted waterways. Unemployment among basin families reached 43% that year. Men who'd spent their entire lives on the water, following patterns their grandfathers had taught them, now had nothing. No jobs in towns they'd never wanted to live in anyway. No skills that translated to the modern economy. No way to feed families except government checks that bought humiliation along with groceries. In that vacuum, some families turned to what had always sustained the basin during hard times. Jean-Paul Boudreaux was 43 years old that September, though he looked closer to 55. He stood 6 feet 1 inch tall, but stooped forward slightly, his spine bent from 3 decades of working hunched in small boats. His face was weathered dark by sun and wind, deep lines carved around his eyes from squinting across water's glare, a thick mustache gone mostly gray, framing a mouth that rarely smiled. His hands were enormous, knuckles swollen from old breaks that hadn't healed properly, fingers scarred from countless encounters with gator teeth, fish, hooks, and oyster shells sharp as razors. A distinctive scar ran from his right ear down to his collarbone, a souvenir from Korea in 1951 when shrapnel from a mortar round had nearly killed him. He walked with a slight limp, his left knee damaged in the same explosion. And when the weather turned cold or rainy, that limp became pronounced enough that his youngest son had to help him into the boat. Every morning, Jean-Paul woke at 4:30 in the houseboat he'd built himself in 1962, a structure of cypress planks and tin roofing anchored in a quiet bayou 3 miles from the nearest road. He'd make coffee in a percolator so old the bottom had been patched twice with solder, drink it black and thick enough to float a spoon, then step outside onto the small deck to smoke one hand-rolled cigarette while watching the sun come up through the cypress trees. By 5:15, he'd be in his flat-bottomed boat, a 16-foot aluminum skiff with a 20-horsepower Evinrude motor, heading out to check the trap lines and hunting spots that had belonged to the Boudreaux family for 4 generations. He'd married Marie-Claire Hébert in 1956, right after his discharge from the Army. They'd had 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter, ranging in age from 22 down to 14. Marie-Claire was 41 now, her hands as work-worn as Jean-Paul's, her face still beautiful despite everything the basin had demanded from her, despite burying her own mother and 2 brothers in accidents that were just part of life on the water. Marcel Boudreaux was 39 that September, 2 inches shorter than Jean-Paul at 5 feet 11 inches, but built thicker, with a barrel chest and arms, heavy with muscle from decades of pulling nets and hauling traps. Where Jean-Paul was quiet and calculating, Marcel was louder, quicker to laugh but also quicker to anger. The kind of man who felt everything intensely and showed it. Thick red beard covered the lower half of his face, and his hands were missing the tip of his left index finger, lost to a snapping turtle in 1968. He'd never married, lived alone in a camp 6 miles from Jean-Paul's houseboat, and spent his evenings drinking whiskey and playing harmonica, the sound of it carrying across the water on still nights. Étienne Boudreaux, the youngest at 35, stood 5 feet 9 inches with a wiry, lean build that came from metabolism rather than any particular fitness routine. He had the same weathered face as his brothers, the same massive scarred hands, but his most distinctive feature was a wandering left eye, damaged in a childhood accident with a fish hook, that gave him a perpetually distracted appearance even when he was completely focused. Étienne had married Celeste Guidry in 1972. They'd had 2 daughters, ages 5 and 3, and he lived in a stilt house 10 miles south of Jean-Paul. The 3 brothers had worked together since childhood, following their father Raymond Joseph into the swamps, learning the Boudreaux family's territory, the best spots for gators, the channels that stayed deep even in drought, the camps where you could shelter during hurricanes. Their father had taught them the code passed down from his own father, who'd come from Acadiana in 1897. You work your own land, you protect your family above everything. You settle your own debts because no one else will. You don't steal from other families, and you don't let anyone steal from you without consequences. When Raymond Joseph had died in 1971, drowned when his boat capsized in a storm, Jean-Paul had become the eldest, the one who made decisions, but the 3 brothers functioned as a single unit. What the Boudreaux brothers valued most wasn't money, though God knew they needed it with 3 families to feed, and no legitimate income beyond occasional odd jobs. What they valued was the independence their hunting territory represented, the knowledge that they could still make their own way in a world that seemed determined to eliminate men like them. Their great-grandfather had claimed this section of the basin in 1897, and 4 generations of Boudreaux men had hunted gators, trapped muskrat and nutria, fished for catfish and bass in these same channels. By 1979, alligator hunting was heavily restricted. The Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries had implemented strict regulations in 1972, limiting the season to 30 days and requiring permits that cost $50 each, permits the Boudreaux brothers couldn't afford and wouldn't have applied for anyway. But the black market for alligator hides remained robust. Tanneries in Texas and Mexico paid $45 per hide for quality specimens, no questions asked. A good hunting season, working night after night from August through October, could yield 200 hides. That meant $9,000 split 3 ways, which was more than most basin families saw in 2 years. The hunting was dangerous, illegal, exhausting work. You had to know exactly where to find the big bulls, had to approach silently in darkness, had to make the kill shot to the brain with a .22 caliber rifle, then drag 200-pound carcasses into the boat and process them immediately before the meat spoiled. The brothers worked in rotation, 1 hunting while 2 processed, skinning the hides carefully to preserve quality, scraping away fat and tissue, treating them with salt, stretching them on frames in their drying shed, a wooden structure on pilings that Jean-Paul had built in 1968, specifically for this purpose. By August 27, 1979, after working every night since early June, the brothers had accumulated exactly 200 prime hides hanging in that shed, worth approximately $9,000, representing their entire income for the year, the only money they had to feed 3 families through the winter. Raymond LeBlanc was 46 years old that summer. a man the Boudreaux brothers had known peripherally for years, someone they'd nod to at the fuel dock in Morgan City but never really talked to, beyond basic courtesies. Raymond stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, with a stocky build, gone slightly soft around the middle, his face round and friendly, the kind of man who smiled easily and remembered everyone's name. He'd moved his operation into the southern edge of Boudreaux territory in 1977, not directly challenging them, but close enough that everyone understood the boundaries were shifting. Raymond had 11 men working with him, a mix of cousins, brothers-in-law, and neighbors from Berwick who'd lost their jobs when the shipyard closed. They weren't criminals by nature, weren't men who'd ever thought about theft or violence. They were husbands and fathers who'd worked legitimate jobs until those jobs disappeared, who'd tried to make it on unemployment and food stamps until the humiliation became unbearable. Raymond's wife, Catherine, had been diagnosed with breast cancer in January of 1979. The treatments at the charity hospital in New Orleans cost money they didn't have. Their oldest daughter needed braces. Their son wanted to attend vocational school. Raymond himself owed $8,000 to various creditors, money borrowed during better times when the shipyard was hiring and the future looked stable. By August of 1979, Raymond LeBlanc was a desperate man, watching his family slip deeper into poverty while his wife grew sicker. And when you're that desperate, principles start to feel like luxuries you can't afford. That's where the Boudreaux hides came in. Word traveled through the basin like water, finding its level. Who had product? Who had buyers? Who might be persuaded to part with either for the right price or the right pressure? Raymond knew about the Boudreaux drying shed. Everyone did. It sat on pilings above the water in a quiet channel, isolated enough that the brothers felt secure, leaving 200 hides unguarded except for padlocks that wouldn't stop anyone determined enough to break them. August 28th, 1979, a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Jean-Paul woke at 4:30, made his coffee, smoked his cigarette, and headed out to check trap lines before the heat became unbearable. Marcel and Étienne were supposed to meet him at the drying shed at 8 o'clock to start the next phase of processing, applying preservative solution to the cured hides before taking them to their buyer in Houma. Jean-Paul arrived at 7:45, tied his boat to the pilings, climbed the ladder to the shed's door, and immediately noticed the padlock hanging open. The hasp bent where someone had used a crowbar. He opened the door already knowing what he'd find, but needing to see it anyway, needing the confirmation before the rage could fully form. The shed was empty. 200 hides, representing 4 months of dangerous work, 6,000 hours of combined labor between 3 brothers, $9,000 they'd already spent in their heads on necessities their families desperately needed, gone. Not a single hide remained. Even the drying racks had been dismantled and taken, leaving only the wooden frame of the shed and the smell of salt and leather that had soaked into the planks. Jean-Paul stood there for 5 minutes, not moving, just looking at the empty space, while his hands slowly formed fists. When Marcel and Étienne arrived 20 minutes later, they found him sitting on the shed steps, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, his face completely expressionless in that way they'd learned to recognize in Korea and Vietnam, the look that meant violence was being calculated, measured, planned. They didn't ask what happened. The open door said everything. Marcel kicked the wall hard enough to crack a board. Étienne just nodded slowly, understanding immediately what this meant, what it would require. The three brothers spent the next 6 hours following the trail. Boot prints in the mud led south. Broken vegetation showed where multiple boats had been loaded heavily. They tracked the evidence through channels they knew intimately, following signs that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't grown up reading the swamp, until they reached Raymond LeBlanc's main camp 15 miles away. Jean-Paul saw their hides immediately. Raymond's crew hadn't even tried to hide them. They were hanging on drying racks behind the main camp structure. 200 distinctive Boudreaux processed hides that Jean-Paul could identify by the specific way they'd been cut and scraped. Raymond himself was there, working on a boat motor with 2 of his men. He looked up when the Boudreaux brothers' boats approached, and something in his face showed he'd been expecting this moment, dreading it, but also resigned to it. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Jean-Paul, keeping his voice level and controlled, said the hides belonged to the Boudreaux family and needed to be returned immediately. Raymond, his own voice shaking slightly, said the hides had been abandoned property, salvaged legally, and besides, he'd already sold them to a buyer in Texas, money already spent on his wife's medical bills. Jean-Paul pointed out that the shed had been locked, that the padlock had been broken, that everyone in the basin knew those hides belonged to the Boudreaux family. Raymond said he didn't know anything about any shed, suggested maybe Jean-Paul should take it up with the sheriff's department in Morgan City if he had a complaint. That's when Marcel stepped forward, his face red, fists clenched, and Étienne had to physically restrain him while Jean-Paul continued, talking in that same level voice, explaining very carefully that Raymond had exactly 24 hours to return every hide or find $9,000 cash. Otherwise, consequences would follow that Raymond wouldn't like. Raymond, perhaps emboldened by having 11 men within shouting distance while the Boudreaux brothers were alone, said he didn't respond well to threats, suggested Jean-Paul should leave before things got ugly. The brothers left without another word, but everyone present understood that something irreversible had just been set in motion. Jean-Paul tried the legal route first, drove 43 miles to the St. Mary Parish Sheriff's Department in Morgan City on August 29th, filed a formal complaint with a deputy who listened politely, took notes, and explained that, without witnesses or physical evidence of the actual theft, there wasn't much law enforcement could do. 3 weeks passed, September 1st through September 22nd, 1979. Jean-Paul spent those weeks in a state of controlled rage, working through scenarios, discarding options, gradually accepting that the law wasn't going to help, that Raymond LeBlanc and his crew had stolen the Boudreaux family's entire livelihood and would face no consequences unless Jean-Paul created those consequences himself. Marie-Claire begged him to let it go. They'd had this conversation 14 times by her count, always ending the same way. She'd point out they could start over, hunt more gators next season, find other work. He'd explain in that quiet voice that it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the principle, about what happens when men think they can steal from you without repercussions. She'd remind him about their children, about the fact that violence would destroy their family, even if it succeeded. He'd agree, then continue planning anyway. Because some things were more fundamental than safety, more important than family, coded so deep into who he was that choosing differently would mean becoming someone else entirely, someone he couldn't recognize in the mirror. Marcel needed no convincing. From the moment he'd seen the empty shed, his position had been clear and unchanging. Raymond LeBlanc and his crew had declared war, and wars ended with casualties. Étienne struggled more, thought about his daughters, thought about Celeste, raising them alone if this went wrong. But ultimately, his loyalty to his brothers and his own sense of justice overcame his hesitation. The three of them began planning on September 10th. They spent 12 days mapping out LeBlanc's operation, locations of his 3 camps, patterns of movement, who slept where, which men were likely armed, optimal approach routes, through channels that would mask engine noise. Jean-Paul drew detailed diagrams on paper that he burned after Marcel and Étienne memorized them. They cleaned their weapons: 3 12-gauge shotguns, 2 hunting rifles, various knives, checking and rechecking mechanisms until everything functioned perfectly. On September 20th, Jean-Paul read from his grandfather's Bible one final time, passages about justice and retribution from the Old Testament that seemed to speak directly to his situation. September 23rd, 1979, a Sunday evening. Temperature at sunset was 87 degrees, with humidity hovering around 92%. The air so thick with moisture it felt like breathing through wet cloth. The brothers met at Jean-Paul's houseboat at 7:30, just as the last light was fading through the cypress trees. They loaded weapons into 2 boats, covered them with tarps, and sat for 15 minutes in complete silence, each man alone with his thoughts, understanding that what they were about to do would change everything, that there would be no going back, that by sunrise they would either be murderers or dead themselves. At 8:15, with full darkness settled over, the basin and fog beginning to rise from the water, they started their engines and headed south. The northern camp held 3 men, Raymond's youngest crew members, cousins from Berwick, who'd only been working with LeBlanc since July. They were sleeping in hammocks strung between cypress trees when the Boudreaux brothers arrived at 11:20. Jean-Paul approached first, moving silently through shallow water, his boots making no sound in the mud. The first man never woke. Jean-Paul fired once from 6 feet away, the 12-gauge blast so loud in the night silence that every bird within a quarter mile took flight. The second man sat up in his hammock, confused and disoriented, and Marcel shot him before he could fully process what was happening. The third man made it to his feet, started running toward the boat tied to the camp's dock, and Étienne's rifle shot caught him in the back, dropping him face first into black water that immediately began spreading red in the moonlight. The entire sequence took less than 90 seconds. The brothers stood there for a moment, breathing hard, looking at what they'd done. The 3 bodies that represented the point of no return. Then Jean-Paul reloaded his shotgun, said they needed to keep moving, and they climbed back into their boats and headed toward the main camp 8 miles southeast, where Raymond LeBlanc and 4 more men were sleeping, completely unaware that their last night had already begun. The brothers did not go to the main camp that first night. The decision belonged to Jean-Paul, though none of them argued it. He said they would wait, let a full day pass, give Raymond LeBlanc the chance to understand what had happened and what was coming next. Maybe Raymond would run, maybe he would surrender. Maybe he would come to them on his knees, begging for terms that did not exist. None of the brothers truly believed any of that would happen, but the pause mattered to Jean-Paul. It gave the violence shape. It made it deliberate instead of frantic. They returned to their separate homes in the pre-dawn darkness of September 24th, their skiffs cutting quietly through water that looked black and endless beneath the fading stars. No one spoke on the ride back. There was nothing left to say. Each of them replayed the same images in his head. The surprise on the men's faces, the way bodies reacted to bullets, the sounds that would never quite fade. Jean-Paul cleaned his rifle at the kitchen table while the coffee maker hissed and sputtered. His hands were steady, precise, practiced. Mary Claire watched from the doorway. When he finally looked up, their eyes met, and she saw the truth immediately. There was blood spattered on his boots, dried to dark against the leather. There was emptiness in his eyes, the same emptiness she had seen when he came home from Korea 23 years earlier. She said nothing. Words would not have changed anything. She understood that the man she had married was gone again, replaced by someone who followed a code she could never reach and never soften. Jean-Paul slept for perhaps 2 hours, the kind of shallow sleep that brought no rest. He woke with his heart racing, the echo of gunfire still ringing in his ears. Outside, the day passed slowly, heavy with humidity and unspoken tension. By afternoon, rumors had begun to move through the basin like a sickness. 3 bodies found, floating near the northern camp. Sheriff's Department boats searching the channels. Families asking questions about missing sons and cousins and brothers who had not come home. Raymond LeBlanc knew. Jean-Paul was certain of it. News traveled too fast in places like this. But instead of running or calling the authorities or attempting some kind of negotiation, Raymond stayed. He gathered what remained of his crew at the main camp and armed them. 4 men, 4 guns. Perhaps he believed numbers still mattered. Perhaps he thought the Boudreaux brothers would not dare attack a fortified position. Or perhaps he simply had nowhere else to go. Running would have meant abandoning the only life he had ever known. At 9:40 that night, the brothers returned to the water. The main camp sat on a small island, maybe 2 acres of solid ground, surrounded by narrow channels too shallow for large boats. The brothers approached from 3 directions. Engines cut 200 yards out. They paddled the rest of the way in silence, fog closing around them so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. Sound carried strangely in the mist. Every splash felt too loud. Every breath sounded like a shout. Raymond had posted a lookout, but the man was careless. He stood on the front porch, smoking a cigarette, the glowing tip a bright orange beacon in the dark. His night vision was ruined by the flame. He never saw Étienne raise the rifle. The shot dropped him instantly, his body collapsing against the railing, and then sliding to the floorboards with a dull, final thud. The brothers moved forward without hesitation. The waiting was over. The gunfire erupted all at once. The 4 remaining men came out shooting, panic overriding any plan they might have had. Raymond LeBlanc carried a pump-action shotgun, his movements frantic but determined. His brother-in-law, Thomas, wielded a .30-06 hunting rifle, the kind passed down through families and meant for deer, not men. The 2 younger crew members had pistols they had probably never fired at anything more threatening than tin cans, nailed to fence posts. The firefight lasted maybe 3 minutes, though it felt much longer. Darkness strobed with muzzle flashes. Gunshots echoed across the water, sharp and disorienting. Birds exploded from the trees in blind panic, their wings beating wildly through smoke and fog. Marcel took a load of birdshot in his left shoulder. 17 pellets tore through his shirt and embedded in muscle. The pain was immediate and blinding, but it did not stop him. He gritted his teeth, raised his weapon, and kept firing. Blood soaked his sleeve as he advanced toward the camp's main structure, putting 3 rounds through the wooden wall where he had seen movement. Jean-Paul circled to the right, using a massive cypress tree for cover. He waited, breathing slow, forcing his hands to remain steady. When Thomas leaned around the corner to aim his rifle, Jean-Paul was already sighting down his shotgun barrel. The blast caught Thomas square in the chest from 15 feet away, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into the camp interior like a broken doll. Raymond stayed inside, firing through windows, shouting orders that no one could follow. He screamed for his men to fall back, to get to the boats, but there was nowhere to go. The brothers had positioned themselves carefully. Every escape route was covered. The 2 younger men ran anyway. One headed for the dock, splashing through shallow water. Étienne shot him in the legs. The man collapsed, screaming, thrashing, until Étienne walked over and ended it with a second shot. The other man reached a boat, managed to start the engine, and pulled away from the dock. Jean-Paul fired once. The bullet took the man in the back of the head. The boat continued in a wide, empty circle until it crashed into a stand of cypress trees 100 yards away. Raymond was alone. He stopped shooting. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Marcel's heavy breathing sounded loud in the stillness. Somewhere in the distance, the unmanned boat's engine continued to run. Jean-Paul called out, told Raymond it could end now. Raymond answered with another shotgun blast through the window. They burned him out. It was Marcel who found the 5-gallon container of diesel fuel near the generator shack, half hidden beneath a sagging blue tarp. He held it up in the firelight, leaking through the boarded windows, and said nothing, just gave a single nod. The decision had already been made. Jean-Paul took the container from him, his movements slow, heavy, deliberate. The weight of what they were about to do settled into the spaces between them, like the fog that had clung to the riverbanks the night before. No one argued. No one offered an alternative. Jean-Paul walked the perimeter of the main structure, sloshing the fuel along the outer walls, soaking the weather-beaten boards and the moss that hung like rags from the eaves. The smell was immediate, sharp, and chemical, cutting through the lingering smoke from earlier gunfire. Marcel lit a match from a book he carried in his shirt pocket, an old habit from his days working the rigs, where fire was both constant threat and occasional necessity. He handed it to Jean-Paul. The flame danced between Jean-Paul's fingers for a second longer than necessary. Then he dropped it. The fire caught with terrifying speed. The flames raced upward, licking across the walls like they had been waiting for this moment, like the old building had always known it would die this way. Within seconds, the entire front of the structure was engulfed. Black smoke billowed out the broken windows. The heat pushed the brothers back a step, then another. Glass shattered. The roof groaned. Inside, Raymond LeBlanc screamed. He came stumbling out less than half a minute later, coughing and blinded by the smoke, his clothes singed and steaming. He no longer had the shotgun. Whether he'd left it behind or dropped it in the confusion, it didn't matter. He was unarmed and half blind, stumbling forward like a man walking into his own funeral. He reached the edge of the porch, tripped on the last step, and hit the ground hard. Mud clung to his hands as he tried to crawl toward the water. He didn't make it more than 5 feet before Jean-Paul raised his rifle. The shot was clean, a single round to the chest. Raymond jerked, then slumped forward into the mud and did not move again. Jean-Paul lowered the weapon and stood still as the flames finished their work. He watched as the roof caved in, as sparks leapt into the air and vanished against the stars. They had burned the center of Raymond's world to ash. There was no coming back from this. Not for Raymond, not for them. The fire lit the sky for miles. Anyone within earshot would hear the crackling, the collapse, the quiet afterward. They had eliminated 8 men in 2 nights. But they were not finished. 6 remained. The southern camp was next, and it was different. These were not seasoned crew members with long histories of theft and violence. They were new blood, hired hands. Temporary labor brought on in August to handle extra trapping routes and the growing pile of hides. Among them was Raymond's only son, 19-year-old Antoine LeBlanc. Jean-Paul had seen the boy around town before. Antoine worked part-time at the Morgan City Marina, polite to the older fishermen, always respectful when he gassed up the Boudreaux boats. He had a girlfriend, plans for technical school in Baton Rouge. A good kid by most accounts, someone who should have had time. But time had run out. The logic of their mission allowed no exceptions. The code, the one that had guided Jean-Paul and his brothers through 2 wars, through 30 years of silence and sacrifice, did not recognize innocence. It only recognized betrayal, blood, and resolution. Every man connected to the stolen hides had to be removed, every witness silenced, even if that witness was 19 and barely out of boyhood. They reached the southern camp at 2:30 in the morning. Fog hung low across the marsh like a veil. The bunkhouse stood near the tree line, a squat structure with warped siding and a sagging porch. A dim lantern burned inside, visible through a grease-smudged window. But no one was awake. No sounds came from within. No lookout had been posted. Étienne cut the skiff's engine 100 yards out. The brothers paddled the rest of the way. They came ashore, silently, boots sinking into the muddy bank. Marcel carried the shotgun now. Jean-Paul held the rifle with numb hands. He could feel his heart pounding, slow and deep, like a drumbeat coming up through the soles of his feet. They stood outside the door for a long moment. Jean-Paul hesitated. He had pulled triggers before. In Korea, in backcountry fights over lines in the mud. On the first 2 nights of this war. But this was different. These men were sleeping, unarmed, unsuspecting. There would be no return fire, no cries for backup, only the sound of death coming through a splintered door. He took a breath to speak. to ask his brothers if they were sure, if this was truly the line they wanted to cross. And then Étienne moved. He pushed past Jean-Paul, stepped onto the porch, and kicked open the door in one motion. The hinges screamed. A moment later, the room erupted in chaos and blood. The door slammed open with a sound like judgment. Étienne entered first. The shotgun roared once, twice, 3 times. The first 3 men died in their bunks. One never even opened his eyes. The second sat up in time to see the barrel turn toward him. The third raised a hand as if to ward off the blast, but it made no difference. The force of the shots splattered blood across the ceiling, shredded the mattresses, turned the air into mist. Jean-Paul followed, weapon raised but unused. He was moving through molasses, through memory, through the weight of every rule he'd ever lived, by suddenly twisting into something monstrous. The fourth man, Antoine Leblanc, jerked awake and screamed his father's name. That scream cut through the gunfire like lightning through storm clouds. Marcel didn't flinch. He raised his pistol and fired, hitting the boy in the throat. Antoine fell back, gasping, eyes wide, hands scrabbling at the air as if he could hold on to the life rushing out of him. Jean-Paul didn't stop it. He couldn't. The moment passed and the boy died on the floor with his arms outstretched. The fifth man made it to the window. He had almost escaped. His torso had cleared the frame. Then Étienne's knife appeared, driven into the man's back with such force that the blade vanished up to the hilt. The man screamed, thrashed, kicked, but Étienne held him there, pulling the knife out and driving it in again. 3 times. The man sagged and went still, half inside and half out, blood dripping down the siding like spilled paint. The 6th man, the youngest, was only 17. He had hidden under his bunk the moment the shooting started. He had not moved, not until Jean-Paul's boots came into view, standing just inches from his face. "Please," he said, voice cracking with desperation. "Please, I don't know anything. I just started working for Mr. LeBlanc last week. I swear. I don't know about no hides. I was just hauling cages. I haven't even been paid yet. I haven't done nothing wrong." He begged in French and English. He cried. Jean-Paul stood over him, the shotgun aimed down. 5 seconds passed. Jean-Paul tried to find something in the boy's eyes, something that would justify mercy. But all he saw was youth and fear and everything he himself had already killed in his own soul. He pulled the trigger. Silence followed. Not peace. Just the hollow, final absence of sound. The bunkhouse smelled of blood, sweat, gunpowder, and something deeper, something old and rotted. The brothers stood among 6 corpses. 14 men had died across 3 nights. 14 families would mourn. 14 names would echo across the bayou in whispered stories and funeral prayers. Jean-Paul sat on the edge of a blood-soaked bunk, his rifle resting across his knees. His hands trembled. Marcel leaned against the wall, eyes closed. Étienne wiped the blade of his knife on the edge of a blanket, methodical as always. They had done what they came to do. They left the bodies where they fell. No words. No last rites. No regrets they could speak aloud. They climbed into their boats and headed home through the pre-dawn dark. They knew there was no running, only waiting. September 28th, 1979, a Friday morning that began with commercial fisherman Dale Prejean piloting his shrimp boat through a channel near the northern camp and seeing what he initially thought was a dead gator floating in the water. By the time he realized it was a human body, partially submerged and beginning to bloat in the heat, he'd already come close enough to see two more bodies tangled in cypress roots along the bank. Dale radioed the Coast Guard station in Morgan City at 6:47 in the morning, his voice shaking as he reported multiple casualties in the Atchafalaya Basin, and within 2 hours, the St. Mary Parish Sheriff's Department had mobilized every available deputy and boat. Sheriff Claude Bergeron, a 56-year-old career law enforcement officer who'd served 32 years in the parish, arrived at the scene by 9:15 and immediately understood this wasn't a typical swamp accident or even a murder-suicide between partners. The bodies showed signs of execution-style eliminations, close-range shotgun wounds, and the positioning suggested they'd been killed where they slept or stood guard. By noon, deputies had located the burned remains of the main camp and found 5 more bodies, 2 inside the charred structure, 3 scattered around the perimeter, all bearing similar wounds. The southern camp yielded 6 additional casualties discovered on September 29th by state police investigators who joined the search. 14 total victims, all male, ages ranging from 17 to 48, all connected to Raymond LeBlanc's trapping operation. The FBI field office in New Orleans dispatched Special Agent Robert Guidry on September 30th, and by October 1st, federal investigators had established that this was the largest mass elimination in Louisiana history outside of organized crime hits in the city. The evidence trail was surprisingly clear. Witnesses at the Morgan City Marina reported seeing the Boudreaux brothers loading weapons into their boats on September 23rd. A shrimper named Louis Thibodeau told investigators he'd heard sustained gunfire from the direction of LeBlanc's main camp on the night of September 24th. Most damning was the confrontation between Jean-Paul Boudreaux and Raymond LeBlanc on August 29th, witnessed by 4 people at LeBlanc's camp, where Jean-Paul had explicitly threatened consequences if the stolen hides weren't returned. Deputies interviewed Marie-Claire Boudreaux, Marcel's neighbors, Étienne's wife Celeste, all of whom confirmed the brothers had been gone on the nights in question, returning home in the early morning hours with blood on their clothes and a haunted look in their eyes. The brothers themselves made no attempt to flee. They stayed at their respective homes, going about their normal routines as if waiting for the inevitable. When Sheriff Bergeron and 6 deputies arrived at Jean-Paul's houseboat on October 2nd at 7:30 in the morning, Jean-Paul was sitting on his front deck drinking coffee. He watched the boats approach, set his cup down carefully, and stood with his hands already raised in a posture of surrender. He said 3 words before anyone could read him his rights, words that would be quoted in every newspaper article and court document that followed. We handled business. Marcel and Étienne were arrested within the hour at their own homes, neither offering any resistance, both remaining completely silent as deputies secured them in handcuffs and transported them to the parish jail. The arrests made national news. CNN sent a crew to Morgan City. The New York Times ran a front-page story about violence in America's forgotten rural communities. Newsweek published a feature titled Bayou Justice, complete with photos of the burned camp and interviews with victims' families. The story had everything media craved: working-class desperation, family loyalty, frontier justice, a body count high enough to guarantee attention, and the exotic setting of Louisiana swampland that played into every stereotype about the Deep South. Legal experts debated whether the brothers could claim any form of justification or self-defense. The theft of the alligator hides was illegal since the brothers had no permits, which complicated any argument about protecting their property. The systematic nature of the eliminations, spread over 3 nights, eliminated any possibility of claiming heat of passion or temporary insanity. The prosecution had 14 bodies, multiple witnesses, physical evidence, and the defendant's own admission that they'd handled their business. The defense had almost nothing except the sympathies of a community that understood, even if they couldn't condone, why the Boudreaux brothers had done what they'd done. Public opinion in the Basin and surrounding parishes was surprisingly divided. Many locals saw the brothers as murderers who'd crossed every moral and legal boundary. But others, particularly those who'd spent their lives struggling in an economy that had abandoned them, who understood the desperation of watching your livelihood stolen while law enforcement shrugged and said there was nothing they could do, expressed a kind of reluctant admiration for men who'd followed the old codes, who'd settled their own debts the way their grandfathers had, who'd refused to be victims even if the cost was their own destruction. The trial began on January 14th, 1980, in the St. Mary Parish Courthouse, a red brick building in Morgan City that had seen its share of dramatic cases, but nothing approaching the scale or media attention of State of Louisiana versus Boudreaux. District Attorney Michel Broussard, a 43-year-old prosecutor with political ambitions and a reputation for aggressive courtroom tactics, handled the case personally, flanked by 2 assistant DAs and extensive support from both state and federal law enforcement. The defense team consisted of court-appointed attorneys, overworked public defenders who'd never handled a death penalty case, facing a prosecution with unlimited resources and a crime so clear-cut that mounting any meaningful defense seemed impossible. Jury selection took 3 weeks. The prosecution wanted jurors from urban areas who'd have no sympathy for rural codes of honor. The defense wanted locals who'd understand the context, the economic desperation, the failure of institutions that had left the Boudreaux brothers with no legal recourse. When their livelihood was stolen, they settled on a jury of 8 men and 4 women. Average age 46. Mix of occupations ranging from teachers to factory workers to retirees. None from the immediate Basin area, but all from parishes that had experienced similar economic collapse. The prosecution's case was devastatingly simple. 14 men were dead. The Boudreaux brothers had killed them in premeditated execution-style eliminations spread over 3 nights. Physical evidence, ballistics, witness testimony, all pointed to the defendants. The brothers had made no secret of their intentions, had threatened Raymond LeBlanc publicly, had been seen loading weapons, had returned home with blood on their clothes, had admitted to the eliminations using the phrase, handled business. District Attorney Broussard walked the jury through each casualty methodically, showing crime scene photographs that several jurors visibly recoiled from, calling family members to testify about the men who'd been taken from them, emphasizing the youngest victims, 17-year-old Marcus Hebert and 19-year-old Antoine LeBlanc, boys barely old enough to shave who'd been eliminated in their sleep. He painted the Boudreaux brothers as cold-blooded killers who'd dispensed vigilante justice based on codes that had no place in modern society, who'd appointed themselves judge, jury, and executioner, who'd murdered 14 human beings over stolen alligator hides that the brothers had been hunting illegally anyway. The defense tried to establish context. They called witnesses who testified about the economic devastation of the basin, the 43% unemployment, the collapse of industries that had sustained these communities for generations, the desperation of families with no options and no hope. They brought in experts who explained the cultural codes of Cajun and Creole communities, the tradition of settling disputes privately, the historical isolation from law enforcement that had created alternative systems of justice. They put Jean-Paul on the stand for 2 days, and he told his story in a quiet, controlled voice, explaining about his great-grandfather claiming the territory, about 4 generations of Boudreaux men working those channels, about the hides representing not just money, but identity, legacy, the only inheritance he had to pass to his sons. He admitted everything. Admitted planning the eliminations, admitted carrying them out, admitted feeling no remorse because Raymond LeBlanc had stolen something sacred and left him no choice. The prosecution destroyed him on cross-examination. Broussard asked him point by point about each victim, asked him to explain why 17-year-old Marcus Hebert, who'd only been working for LeBlanc for 2 weeks, deserved to die. Asked him to justify eliminating 19-year-old Antoine LeBlanc, Raymond's son, a kid with no criminal record who'd been sleeping when Jean-Paul's shotgun blast ended his life. Asked him how $9,000 worth of illegally hunted alligator hides justified 14 murders. Jean-Paul had no answers that satisfied anyone outside the basin's codes. He kept returning to the same theme, that a man protects what's his, that stealing from family demands consequences, that the law had failed him and left him no choice. But sitting in a climate-controlled courtroom, wearing an orange jumpsuit, those justifications sounded hollow even to sympathetic ears. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They requested transcripts of testimony. They asked to review crime scene photographs again. They sent questions to the judge about the legal definitions of premeditation, about whether economic desperation could constitute mitigating circumstances, about how to weigh cultural context against the simple fact of 14 dead bodies. On January 27, 1980, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts for all 3 defendants, first-degree murder, 14 counts each. The courtroom erupted in a chaos of sobbing from victims' families and stunned silence from the Boudreaux supporters who'd packed the gallery hoping for a miracle. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Jean-Paul received life without possibility of parole, the judge citing his leadership role and the premeditated nature of the eliminations. Marcel received 40 years with possibility of parole after 25. Étienne received 35 years with possibility of parole after 22, the judge acknowledging his more limited role and his young children as mitigating factors. All 3 were transported to Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola on February 23, 1980, beginning sentences that would span decades and destroy multiple generations of families on both sides of the tragedy. Marie-Claire Boudreaux tried to hold the family together. She was 41 years old, with 4 children ranging from 22 down to 14, when her husband was imprisoned for life. The oldest son, Jean-Paul Jr., was already working as a mechanic in Morgan City. He continued supporting the family financially, but the relationship with his mother grew strained as he blamed his father's codes and pride for destroying their lives. The middle son, Claude, was 19, dropped out of technical school, and spent the next 5 years drinking heavily and getting into fights in Morgan City bars before finally stabilizing in his mid-20s. The youngest son, Michel, was 16 when his father went to prison. He never recovered from the trauma, developed severe depression, attempted suicide twice before his 20th birthday, and eventually moved to Houston to escape the shadow of the Boudreaux name. The daughter, Evangeline, was 14 years old when everything fell apart. She finished high school through sheer determination, got a scholarship to LSU, became a teacher, changed her last name to her mother's maiden name, Hebert, and refused to discuss her father with anyone, even her own children, years later. Marie-Claire visited Jean-Paul at Angola once a month for the first 10 years, driving 3 hours each way to sit in a visitation room and talk to her husband through plexiglass about weather and children and nothing that really mattered, because the important conversations about what he'd done and why and whether it was worth it were too painful to have. She stopped visiting in 1990 when the drive became too difficult and the man behind the glass bore too little resemblance to the husband she'd married. She died in 2003 at age 64 from complications of diabetes, having spent the final 23 years of her life defined by one autumn when her husband chose code over family. Marcel's story was shorter but no less tragic. He served his sentence at Angola, working in the fields under the same brutal sun that had weathered him in the Basin. He developed lung cancer in 2001, likely from decades of smoking hand-rolled cigarettes, and died in the prison hospital on March 7th, 2003, at age 62. His body was returned to his sister for burial. 17 people attended the funeral. Étienne was released on parole in 2002 after serving 22 years. He was 57 years old, his health destroyed by prison, his daughters grown and married with children he'd never met. His wife Celeste had divorced him in 1987, remarried in 1990, moving to Lafayette to start over away from the Basin and its memories. Étienne lived alone in a trailer outside Morgan City, worked occasionally doing maintenance work at the marina, and died of a heart attack in 2019 at age 75, largely forgotten by everyone except the few old-timers who remembered that autumn in 79. Jean-Paul served 38 years in Angola. He never applied for parole, never sought clemency, never expressed remorse in any form that would have satisfied the parole board. He worked in the prison's maintenance department, attended chapel services, read his Bible, and kept mostly to himself, earning a reputation as a quiet inmate who caused no trouble but also showed no interest in rehabilitation or redemption. He died on November 3, 2018, at age 82 from complications of pneumonia. The prison chaplain later said Jean-Paul's final words, spoken 2 days before he lost consciousness, were about the hides, about how beautiful they'd looked hanging in the drying shed that August, about how proud he'd been of the work. The 14 victims' families were destroyed in different ways, each tragedy unique but sharing common elements of sudden loss, economic devastation, and trauma that echoed through generations. Catherine LeBlanc, Raymond's widow, buried her husband while undergoing chemotherapy for the breast cancer that had motivated his desperate decision to steal the hides in the first place. She survived the cancer, but lost their house to medical debt and died in 2006 in a nursing home in Houma, having spent her final years in poverty, despite the best efforts of her children to support her. Antoine LeBlanc's girlfriend, Jessica Rodrigue, was 17 and 3 months pregnant when he was eliminated. She gave birth to a daughter, Marie, in March of 1980, and raised her alone with assistance from her parents, never marrying, never fully recovering from the loss of the future she'd imagined. Marcus Hebert's parents, both dead now, spent decades lobbying for changes to parole laws, appearing at every hearing where the Boudreaux brothers came up for consideration, ensuring that their son's elimination was never forgotten by the justice system. The combined families, 11 widows and 23 children, made fatherless that September, formed a support network that persisted for years, gathering annually on September 23rd to remember and mourn, keeping alive the memory of men who'd made one catastrophic decision and paid with their lives. The basin itself changed after that autumn. For several years following the eliminations, people were more careful with each other. Disputes were settled quickly and quietly. Boundaries were respected with exaggerated care. Nobody wanted to be the person who pushed a desperate man too far, who triggered the next tragedy. The churches filled on Sundays as people sought meaning in violence that defied explanation. Community organizations formed to provide economic assistance and conflict mediation, attempting to prevent future desperate acts through intervention and support. But the change wasn't permanent. Within a decade, new people moved into the basin who didn't know the story or didn't care, who saw abandoned camps and empty channels without understanding what had happened there. The economic pressures that had driven Jean-Paul Boudreaux to violence never really left. They just evolved, adapted, found new forms. By the 2000s, the basin faced different challenges: environmental degradation, coastal erosion, oil spills. But the fundamental isolation and economic abandonment remained constant. Human nature being what it is, the lessons were forgotten, the codes persisted, and new conflicts emerged that sometimes ended in violence, though never again on the scale of September 1979. FBI Special Agent Robert Guidry, who led the federal investigation, retired in 2010 after 37 years of service. In a 2019 podcast interview about the case that had defined his career, he spoke with obvious discomfort about the moral complexities that still troubled him 4 decades later. Legally, the Boudreaux brothers were mass murderers, and the evidence was so overwhelming there was never any question about their guilt. But morally, the situation was far messier. These weren't career criminals or sociopaths. They were desperate men in a failed system who'd been taught from childhood that a man protects what's his, that honor matters more than law, that sometimes violence is the only language certain situations understand. The law says one thing, the Bayou says another. And I've had to live with that contradiction every day since I closed that case file. I've investigated hundreds of crimes, solved most of them, but the Boudreaux case is the one that still keeps me awake some nights. Because technically I did my job perfectly, we got convictions, justice was served by every legal standard, But I'm still not sure we achieved anything except destroying more families and proving that rural codes and modern law can't coexist. The story became legend in South Louisiana, a cautionary tale told by old-timers in marina bars and fishing camps, referenced whenever disputes arose, used to teach lessons nobody could quite articulate. Don't steal from desperate men. Don't underestimate what ordinary people will do when pushed beyond their breaking point. Don't mistake silence for acceptance or isolation for weakness. The Boudreaux eliminations, that's what locals called them, ignoring the 14 LeBlanc casualties in favor of the three brothers who'd sacrificed everything for principle, became shorthand for the moment when honor transforms into horror, when protecting family becomes destroying families, when codes that sound noble in theory reveal their terrible cost in practice. Jean-Paul Boudreaux's story has no heroes. It has a father who loved his family's legacy more than his own freedom, more than his wife's happiness, more than his children's futures. It has 14 neighbors who made one catastrophic decision: stealing from the wrong man at the wrong time, triggering violence that consumed them all. It has a system that failed at every level, an economy that abandoned South Louisiana, leaving people with no legal way to survive, law enforcement 40 miles away and underfunded, unable to protect property or mediate dispute, and a culture of self-reliance so deeply ingrained that asking for help was seen as weakness, that ancient codes seemed more real than any law written in distant state. Capitals.